The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
And of course, that is where our solar system is located. Now, you know the Milky Way galaxy spiral arms, right? Now, the spiral arms are not actually composed of stars and different things. They're more like pressure waves, and they sweep through the stars, and star systems get caught up and fall out of the spiral arms as the Milky Way galaxy rotates. Now, if we are in the spiral arms, that's bad. That's a bad place to be. A lot of radiation, a lot of heat. We can't live there, okay? We need to be outside of the spiral arms. And we need to not get swept up into the spiral arms. And we are in a particular circular range. It is a zone that's what they call not circumstellar, that's for the solar system. The circle in the galaxy, I forget the word for this actually. The circular galactic, I forget my correct adjective. But we're in a place where we are locked. And we go around the center at the same rate as the spiral arms turn. Our solar system never gets swept up into the spiral arms. But Gonzalez mentioned this for another reason. He says this: if you're in the spiral arm, not only can you not live, but it also turns out it's a terrible place to be for science because you cannot see through it out into the wider universe. And he says, we are at the place where we need to be to live, and we're also at the place between the spiral arms where we can see out into the universe. And it turns out that the best place, the place where we need to be to live, is also meets the design of what we need to discover things about the universe. So I don't know, maybe it's because, the universe, part of what it's meant to do is not just provide for us a place to live, but it's to provide us testimony about itself and about its maker. Somewhere somebody said, the heavens declare the glory of God. Have you ever heard that? You ever read that? Okay, so I don't know. Maybe that has something to do with it. Okay, so because of this, mainstream scientists have come to certain conclusions. Fred Hoyle, who resisted the Big Bang Theory, he said this: a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology. And Paul Davies has moved from promoting atheism to conceding that the laws of physics themselves seem to be the product of exceedingly ingenious design. And he says, there is for me powerful evidence that there's something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. And I could just multiply quote after quote after quote. But let me just give you one more. Robert Jastrow, who is an astronomer and an agnostic, he wrote some years ago a book called God and the Astronomers, and he concludes this way: for the scientist who has lived by his faith and the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Okay? And so this is really what the testimony of science is. It indicates design for the universe. And so it's not controversial today for cosmologists to freely use words like design, creation, creator, and this kind of language, right? It's not going to cost them their job. It's just normal to talk about this, even though they may not be advocating so-called the biblical God, so to speak, or thinking in those terms. But that's where the science is pointing. But it gets more controversial when we talk about living things and biology. There's definitely a lot more resistance in those fields of science than in astronomy and physics and cosmology. And so I'm going to say a few things about the intelligent design movement, which focuses more on the biological realm, but not exclusively so. The idea movement began as a movement against this idea that we need to do science as methodological naturalists. Remember, we talked about that last session. That God can never be an explanatory factor in our scientific theory. So they want to overturn this philosophy of science, as well as overturn the stranglehold that Darwinism has on biology. And so it's an ideologically diverse and religiously diverse movement of people that came together as a result of these two core convictions. Of course, there are many Christians in this movement, but there are also Jews, agnostics, cult members, a member of the Unification Church. Okay, there's all kind of people of different religions in it. There are even some atheists that have said, hey, you know, this movement is doing some good things and we should listen to that. Okay. Among the Christians associated with the intelligent design movement, there are old earth creationists, young earth creationists. There are even a few theistic evolutionists of a certain particular and non-Darwinian type. You might call it a big tent movement that is convinced that we need to overturn this idea of science as methodological naturalism and overturn Darwinism in biology and reinstate design as a respectable scientific historical explanation, especially in historical sciences. And then, having done that, we can argue amongst ourselves about how long it took and all of that sort of thing. Okay? So, in terms of the development of this movement, one influential thing that happened was a publication of Michael Denton's book called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, kind of a precursor to this movement. Denton is an agnostic, or at least at the time he was. I'm not sure really what his position is now. And he wrote a purely scientific critique of evolution, which turned out to be influential among people who would later be members of this ID movement. Now, the real impetus or birth of the movement is often traced to the publication of Philip Johnson's book, Darwin on Trial. Johnson, he was a Supreme Court clerk. He was a law professor, very well educated and understanding arguments and so forth, but eventually came to doubt the whole Darwinian theory. Of course, he is a Christian as well, and of course that could have played a role in it, but he had accepted before the Darwinian theory, and he wrote a purely scientific critique of it, which is published, I forget the original publisher, in subsequent editions it was InterVarsity, but originally it was someone like Random House or something like that, in 1991, and so this material was presented to a mainstream audience. And a lot of people, a lot of scientists that privately had doubts about Darwin were stimulated by this book, and they sort of found one another, and they found Johnson, and they began to have discussions together, and this kind of formed the nucleus of the intelligent design movement, and later led to the founding of the Discovery Institute, which is kind of the primary intelligent design think tank. Now, one of the early things that they produced was a work by Michael Behe called Darwin's Black Box. And for Behe, he recognized and sort of tried to take advantage of a criterion that Darwin himself had suggested to evaluate his theory. Darwin said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And so Behe looked at what Darwin said, and he said, what Darwin is describing we can call irreducible complexity. Okay, so if something cannot be formed by successive slight modifications, or you can't transition from one kind of organ to another by making slight additive changes over time without it breaking down, the theory doesn't work. Okay, so Behe called this irreducible complexity. An irreducibly complex system is one that is composed of several interacting parts where the removal of any of these parts means that function is lost. The system breaks down. And he illustrates this with a mousetrap. Okay, it's a very simple device, but it has 5 parts. You have a wooden platform, a hammer, that's what kills the mouse, a spring, that's what drives the hammer. You have a catch, and you have a metal connecting bar. And it's not like if you just start with a wooden platform, you catch a mouse every 100 years, right? Or you add the spring. You got to have all 5 pieces, and you got to have them all in the same arrangement, and then the thing will work. It will catch mice, okay? And similarly, in biological systems that are irreducibly complex, you have to have all the parts for it to work, and they all have to be in the right place. Loss of function is bad for the organism and usually fatal. I mean, just think about, eyes, okay, maybe, right, if they're not but lungs, heart, right? Okay, so the question for Behe as a biologist is, are there any biological systems that are irreducibly complex? And he explored this, and in his book, Darwin's Black Box, he describes several. Things like the blood clotting process that prevents us from bleeding to death from a small cut, the immune system, the cell itself, all of these are irreducibly complex. So this is a very powerful statement of intelligent design in living things. Besides his book, there's a DVD called The Mystery of Life's Origins that presents this in a very compelling fashion. So this is the idea then of irreducible complexity in living things. Now I want to say, because some of you might say this, because Behe is viewed as a challenge to Darwinists, and they've responded to him. And I remember a previous talk I gave on this. I had a student, and this is very helpful for me because I tell what is going on in universities. And basically he reported to me that their professor had explained that this doesn't work because his professor refuted it. And obviously Darwinists have responded to Behe's claims. But I have to say, as students and as sort of lay scientists or whatever we might be, it's not like these things are decided. There's not like a shootout at the OK Corral and one guy wins. And so what this guy didn't know, it just sounded to me like he just took what his professor said. And I suggested to him, if you go to the Discovery Institute website, you can look at all of their writings where they have responded in journal articles or other media, and there's reply, counter-reply, argument, counter-argument. And that's that's part of the nature of scholarship, whether it's history, controversy, science, philosophy, theology. One guy makes an argument, someone responds, and they keep on going. And that goes on forever. And what I'm saying is, don't just take it on faith that someone has shown, that's shown that Behe is mistaken in this. If you're curious, you go look and see the response and counter-response, and you have to come to some kind of judgment. I can tell you from the field of history, there are some people who are convinced that John F. Kennedy was not assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. Now, I say the issue is absolutely settled, but there are still people that deny it, okay? But that says nothing about the quality of the evidence. And if you look deep into it, then I think you can see which way the evidence points. Okay, similarly with science and these issues of whether or not there are irreducibly complex mechanisms in biology. Another way to think about it is this way. Especially if we think of Darwin as explaining transitions from one type of creature with certain organ systems to another, would this work? Think about it. How do you go from something that has gills to something that has lungs, piece by piece, and maintain function throughout? It's kind of like if you have a Volkswagen, can you change it into a Porsche? That's pretty good. They're both German, right? Can you change a Volkswagen into a Porsche piece by piece and still drive the thing at every step along the way? You understand, right? If we don't have function in our lungs, we're gone in a couple minutes, right? Anyway, something to think about. Okay, another problem for Darwinism, I think, has to do with the fossil record. In two aspects of it. One is the Cambrian explosion, which some have called biology's Big Bang. Paleontology confirms the abrupt appearance of major groups of animals, dozens of genetic types, in the fossil record during a geologically sudden explosion of life in the Cambrian period. What has sometimes been called the Big Bang of biology. By the way, as a Christian, I think I like Big Bangs. Big Bang in cosmology, I like Big Bang in biology as well. As a theologian, I like Big Bang in Christology, but that's another topic for another day. Okay? And so how were all of these major animal groups produced in such a relatively short span of time? And in geological terms, we're still talking in terms of millions of years. According to Dr. Stephen Meyer, to produce each new organism during the Cambrian explosion, you need a whole bunch of new cell types, then you need new proteins to service the different unique cell types, and to build the proteins, you need the genetic information in the form of DNA. The DNA molecule contains information. And Meyer asked the question, where does all that new information come from in the Cambrian explosion? And he argues this way, that information always comes from a mind. And so that's kind of the basis of his argument. But the Cambrian explosion is a big problem for Darwinists. In fact, I have a biology textbook from my university days. Starr and Taggart are the authors. This is what they say as, advocates of Darwinism. They say this: the fossil record repeatedly refuses to show us a gradual and steady development of organic diversity. Instead, organisms as diverse as bats and whales appear quickly, and for the most part, without a succession of intermediate forms. Virtually all phyla whose members have durable shells or skeletons appear suddenly in the span of about 30 million years. Now just bracket that number, we're going to revisit that. In a span of about 30 million years in the early Cambrian. Flowering plants began their adaptive radiation and achieved much of their present diversity in a 10 million year interval in the early Cretaceous. Darwin termed these events inexplicable and an abominable mystery, and they continue to be cited by opponents of evolution today. The fossil record is good enough for us to rule out the possibility of long, unrecorded histories for many of these groups. Biologists now face squarely the evidence that group after group originated and reached most of its morphological diversity in less than 10 to 12 million years' time. And so they acknowledge this picture that we see in the fossil record of the sudden beginning of many different kind of life forms just does not fit the Darwinian picture. They try to come up with certain ways to make this work that maybe could account for these things, but it seems a bit desperate. There's a Chinese paleontologist and a Christian by the name of Paul Chien. In an interview, he said, he responded to this kind of thing. When people talk about how fast the explosion went, prominent figures in the field say a few million years is many generations. But in terms of the kinds of changes we see, a few million years is like nothing. And really what we have here is a kind of an ad hoc thesis that Darwinists appeal to explain the disparity between their theory and the evidence of the Cambrian explosion in the fossil record. Darwinism predicts that a single progenitor would gradually diversify into numerous branching lineages to become the precursors of the various animal phyla. But yet the fossil record shows that virtually all animal phyla originated in the Cambrian explosion. They appear without a trace of the evolutionary ancestors required by Darwinism. And our friend, committed atheist and evolutionary advocate Richard Dawkins laments, it's as though they were just placed there without any evolutionary history. Yeah, okay. All right, why not? And here's the thing. When we talk about the Cambrian explosion, there's a debate among scientists how long it lasted. Starr and Taggart mentioned 30 million years, something like 532 million years BC to 512 million BC. But that window keeps shrinking. And Paul Chien said that now the standard talk is something like 5 to 10 million years that they think about. And he says he himself thinks it's something more like 2 million years. And the smaller that number gets, the more anxious, in terms of anxiety, the Darwinists get. And now the 2 million years sounds like a lot to us, but in terms of the kinds of changes they expect to see by Darwinian mechanisms, it's nothing. Now there's another problem with the fossil record. What time do I need to be done with this, Roland? I'm getting near the end.
1 o'clock.
Oh, good. Oh, we're doing great on time. Okay, there's another problem that Darwinism has with the fossil record. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to advance this. I missed my cue to advance this. Okay, you see Dawkins. It's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Okay, now I want to bring back our friend Stephen Jay Gould. The Cambrian explosion shows the fossil record in the beginning of life's major phyla, major groups. But there's a problem with the overall shape of the fossil record. Darwin said this about the fossil record. In his day, he observed that it does not show gradual evolution. And this is what he said. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic change, and this is perhaps the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory of evolution. Now, his explanation for this was that the fossil record is incomplete. He said this: the geological record is extremely imperfect, and this will, to a large extent, explain why we do not find interminable varieties connecting together all the extinct and existing forms of life by the finest graduated steps. He who rejects these views, though, on the nature of the geological record, will rightly reject my whole theory. So Darwin predicted another criterion by which to evaluate his theory, and that is, does the fossil record eventually reveal evidence to support his view or not? And as Starr and Taggart acknowledged, it doesn't. They have to acknowledge that the fossil record just doesn't show it. And because of that, there's actually a more recent theory of evolution than the neo-Darwinian synthesis. People who are naturalists, people who believe that, yes, single common ancestor, there has to be some kind of evolution, they've come up with a new theory of evolution. And this is driven by paleontology. These are paleontologists, and those who study the fossil record have been motivated. So Darwinism doesn't explain what we see. We need a new theory. So here's what one paleontologist said. David Raup, the curator of the Museum of Natural History in Chicago back in the early 80s, said this: well, we are now 120 years after Darwin, and knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By that I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. And so because of this state of affairs and looking at the fossil record, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge developed a new theory of evolution which they called punctuated equilibrium, in which species remain stable over time, and they don't change except for minor variations. But then there are sudden, abrupt evolutionary transitions that leave no record in the fossil record. Well, how does that work? Well, on their theory, okay, and understand how neo-Darwinism works. Darwinism talks about survival of the fittest, natural selection, right? So that's one side of the equation. Obviously, the fittest survive. Who are the fittest? The ones that survived. Okay, whatever. I'm not sure how much that explains, but obviously we can grant that the fittest survive, okay? But that's a selection type of process. But there needs to be something that generates variety, biological variety, okay? And Darwin didn't have this in his time, but in the early 20th century, through genetics, they postulated that genetic mutation creates biological variety. And that's what we call the neo-Darwinian synthesis. So we have something that generates biological variety, and if the new thing contributes to the survival value of the organism, it is selected, right? So that's basically neo-Darwinianism. Now the problem is this: genetic mutation, we can measure the rates of that sort of thing, and usually genetic mutations either have no effect on survivability or they're not good, right? You know, contrary to the X-Men, mutation is usually not good, okay? If you have a mutation, you're not likely to shoot laser beams out of your eyes. Maybe you won't have eyes, okay? But very, very rarely you can have a positive mutation that might confer some advantage. And so really it's a numbers game. You need large populations so that you get some occasional good mutations. And you need certain varieties of things. And by the way, certain animals like microbes, bacteria, and things like this, we see more mutation, okay, that results in positive change, of course, and that causes us some problems. You need short generation times, you need huge population size and all this kind of thing for the numbers to work out well. But notice what Gould and Eldredge have proposed, that these evolutionary changes happen to small populations. They say that they'll say this: a creature, a species, is put under some kind of environmental pressure. The population is reduced. They say this because it's not in the fossil record. So, and it's when the population is subjected to this pressure, something dramatic happens. Okay, there's a lot going on inside of there covered up by those words. Something dramatic happens that causes an abrupt evolutionary transition, and because there are so few members of the population involved, we're not surprised we don't find it in the fossil record. Okay, so this is what they propose, so they say, hey, this is punctuated equilibrium. That's why we don't find evidence of evolution in the fossil record. Gould called the extreme rarity of transitional forms the trade secret of paleontology. And his co-worker, Niles Eldredge, said this and explained the problems that paleontologists have with Darwin's theory. He said this: "No wonder paleontologists shied away from evolution for so long. It never seems to happen. Assiduous collecting up cliff faces yield zigzags, minor oscillations, and the very occasional slight accumulation of change over millions of years at a rate too slow to account for all the prodigious change that has occurred in evolutionary history. When we do see the introduction of evolutionary novelty, it shows up with a bang, and often with no firm evidence that the fossils did not evolve elsewhere. Evolution cannot forever be going on somewhere else. Yet that's how the fossil record has struck many a forlorn paleontologist looking to learn something about evolution." You know, we can make some predictions as laymen, and I would suggest to you that what a lot of scientists assume is that somewhere else, someone else in some other discipline has the evidence for evolution, even though they don't see it. I was watching a talk show one night, oh man, it's got to be 20 years ago, and it turned out, I think this was Jay Leno, and he had on as a guest like a very great expert in bats who was actually a youngster, like a teenager, very young, but he's just been fascinated with bats all his life, so he studied bats, and if you specialize, even as a teenager, you become an expert, right? So he's on Jay Leno's show. And Jay Leno asked him, and he's talking about different species of bats and so forth, and he had some, specimens to show and stuff. Jay Leno asked him, he said, "So how have bats changed over the millions of years? How have they evolved?" And I blurted out, I said, "They haven't changed at all." And the guy said, Jay, it's really interesting. They really haven't changed. They show up in the fossil, different species of them will show up in the fossil record, they stay the same, and then they're gone. And then, of course, we have some that are still here today, but you don't see them changing. The evidence, someone else always has the evidence, but if you look in your own particular field, you don't see it, all right? I think this is maybe what motivated Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge. They don't see it in the fossil record, their area of expertise. So it turns out there's a debate. Our evolutionist friends are not in agreement. That's normal for scientific theories, and that in and of itself doesn't totally discredit. But notice punctuated equilibrium and neo-Darwinism, though both called evolution, are two different things, and they're mutually exclusive. So in fact, Dawkins and Gould have done things like this. Even though they hate each other, well, we agree about one thing, evolution is true. You can't say that. Is evolution neo-Darwinism, or is it punctuated equilibrium? These are two different things, and they can't both be true. Okay? But this is what Dawkins has said. He has angrily called the punctuated equilibrium advocates creationists, because their view of the fossil record is empirically equivalent to the progressive creationist view that God occasionally creates new species with no evolutionary ancestors. And so I love this debate. I think it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, what is the significance to us? I mean, it's not like it's not like we're picking sides in this thing, because both Gould and Dawkins are atheists, they're naturalists, they're committed to the idea that every living creature has evolved from a single human common ancestor. So you might think we don't really have any skin in this game, but I would suggest to you this is a very significant debate for us. What is that? Well, I would suggest to you that the neo-Darwinian view is right about the biological processes. We do know that genetic mutation happens at such and such a rate, and occasionally, very rarely, they can confer a biological advantage. Now, I don't think, and then of course, if it confers a biological advantage, it's more likely to survive. Okay, I don't have a problem saying that neo-Darwinian forces are at work in the biological realm. Now, I don't think they're sufficient to generate the kind of changes they want to see. I don't think it can take you from primate to human being, or I don't think it shows us a universal common ancestor or anything like that. But these features are at work. in the world, and we can calculate the rates of mutation and all this kind of thing. These biological phenomena and forces are real, okay? The punctuated equilibrium people are all wrong about the biological. They've just come up with some kind of magic force when the population is constrained and something happens, you know? But the punctuated equilibrium advocates are right about the fossil record. That's their specialty. They're paleontologists. The evidence of the fossil record is the kind of changes and transitions that have been argued for by neo-Darwinists has not in fact happened. And so I would say that they're both right about something and they're both wrong about something. But if you add that up, it discredits, I think, the general evolutionary scenario. And so maybe then what we need to do is insist that biological scientists need to be a bit less restrictive in what kind of research programs can be explored. They need to open up the paradigm a bit and allow, I think, the theory of intelligent design past the ideological gatekeepers and see what they can do by taking on the mystery of life's origins and life's history. Okay, let's go ahead and conclude so you guys have a little bit of time to ask some questions. What have I tried to argue here? I've tried to say that the scientific evidence suggests that the universe and Earth were created for us to live here, and that life was created and designed, and that there is some, I would suggest, some fundamental division of living things into natural kinds. Now, whether that correlates with what we call species at that taxonomic level or not is well, secondary, okay? And we've discovered this. I didn't even go into that. You know, we've discovered limits to biological change, but I won't go into that now because I don't have time. Organic systems and living things exhibit irreducible complexity and cannot come into existence step by step or change in their major organic features step by step with those organs continuing to function. And the fossil record suggests that different forms of life, the phyla, kingdom, etc., seem to come into existence, persist for a while with minor change and variation, and go extinct. There's no evidence for common ancestry, although that might be debated. We'll touch on that. Although a few theories are put forward, but they are debatable. The scientific evidence supports creation and design, both of the universe and living things. Okay, and that doesn't exactly get us all the way to Genesis, perhaps, but I think it's a very significant conclusion that the scientific evidence is pointing to quite forcefully nonetheless.